The thaw did not arrive evenly. It came first as softness beneath the surface, ice loosening its grip just enough to let water move, but not enough to drain away. From a distance, the tundra still looked solid, pale and uninterrupted. Up close, the ground told a different story. Footing changed from step to step. What held weight one moment yielded the next. The muskox reached the edge of that change in the early morning. Its body was massive and low, built for cold and resistance rather than speed. Long dark hair hung almost to the ground, brushing against patches of snow and damp soil alike. Beneath the outer coat, dense underwool trapped warmth that had been necessary for months and was now becoming a burden. The muskox stopped. It lowered its head slightly, not to graze, but to sense. The animal did not rely on sight alone here. Weight mattered more. Balance mattered more. The thaw line was not visible as a boundary. It was felt. The first step forward sank. Not deeply, not dangerously, but enough to register. The surface gave way slowly, compressing rather than breaking. Water pressed upward around the hoof, darkening the ground in a widening ring. When the muskox lifted its foot again, the impression remained. The ground did not recover. The muskox shifted its weight and tried again, choosing a slightly higher patch where snow still lingered in thin sheets. This step held longer, but not completely. The snow collapsed into wet granules, sliding aside to expose soil beneath that had not yet decided whether it was solid or fluid. The muskox moved forward anyway. This crossing was necessary. The animals behind it would follow the same route. Grazing grounds lay beyond the thaw. Turning back would mean delay, and delay carried its own risks. Each step took time. The muskox did not hurry. Hurrying here would only deepen collapse. Instead, it placed each hoof deliberately, waited for the ground to respond, then committed its full weight only when resistance felt consistent. Even then, the ground answered slowly. Water rose, soil shifted, ice beneath the surface creaked faintly as pressure redistributed. The muskox stood through it, muscles engaged, body steady, allowing the land to finish moving before taking the next step. The ground took too long. Behind the muskox, shallow depressions filled with cloudy water. They did not drain. They did not spring back. The path was being written into the tundra, not erased. Farther upslope, another muskox watched. It stood still, head raised, nostrils flaring slightly as it tested the air. It did not advance yet. Experience taught it to let the first animal commit fully, to see where the ground would hold and where it would fail. The lead muskox reached the lowest part of the thaw. Here, the surface appeared intact, but the response was slower still. When the hoof pressed down, the ground sagged in stages. First resistance, then gradual surrender. Water pooled around the leg, cold and persistent. The muskox paused mid-step. It waited. This waiting was not hesitation. It was cooperation. The animal allowed the ground to finish changing before forcing it further. Only when the movement beneath slowed did the muskox shift forward again. Wind moved across the tundra, carrying cold air from higher ground. Clouds hung low, flattening light and removing shadows. Everything looked closer and farther at the same time. The muskox continued. By the time it reached firmer ground on the far side, its legs were wet to the knees. Mud clung to long hair, darkening it. Behind, the crossing remained visibly altered, a series of water-filled impressions marking where the ground had been asked to change and had not yet finished doing so. The muskox stopped again and turned its head slightly. The others would follow. The thaw would spread. The ground would respond in its own time, not matching the pace of those who needed to cross it. The tundra did not refuse passage, but it did not grant it quickly either. And as the muskox stood on more stable ground, waiting for the rest of the herd, the thaw behind it continued its slow work, holding shape, holding water, taking far longer to settle than the animals could afford to wait. The others did not follow immediately. They never did when the ground behaved this way. Experience, passed without instruction, held them back. The lead muskox had committed its weight. Now the land needed time to respond, not just beneath one body, but across the path that would soon carry many. The herd stood still on the firmer rise. They were spaced loosely, close enough to read one another's posture, far enough to avoid compounding pressure in one place. Heads were mostly lowered. Breath moved in slow, visible clouds that flattened quickly in the damp air. The lead muskox shifted its stance. Mud clung to its legs and belly hair, adding weight that would not drop away easily. The animal did not shake. Shaking would waste energy and unsettle footing. It stood and let gravity work. Behind it, the thaw continued. Water pooled deeper in the impressions already made. The surface film thickened slightly as fine sediment rose and settled again. The ground was not collapsing further, but it was not recovering either. It was waiting. One of the younger muskoxens stepped forward, not into the thaw yet, just closer to its edge. It lowered its head and tested the air, then placed one hoof down near the first impression. The ground responded immediately, sagging even before full weight was applied. The animal withdrew its foot and paused. That was enough information. The herd waited longer. Wind moved steadily across the tundra, brushing the long hair along their flanks, carrying scent from the thawed ground. Wet soil, old plant matter, the faint mineral smell of ice releasing what it had held. The smell was not dangerous, but it was new. New meant caution. The lead muskox took another step forward onto firmer ground, widening the gap between itself and the thaw. This was deliberate. It made space for those behind to choose their own placement without crowding. Only then did the second muskox begin to cross. It stepped carefully into the first set of impressions, placing hooves where the ground had already been compressed. This reduced the chance of sudden collapse, but it also deepened what was already disturbed. Water rose higher this time, pooling more quickly, responding faster now that the surface tension had been broken. The ground took too long again. The second muskox paused mid-crossing. Weight split unevenly as one hoof sank deeper than expected. The animal leaned forward, muscles tightening along the shoulders and neck, redistributing weight slowly until balance returned. No panic followed. The herd watched. This was not a failure, it was data. One by one, the others followed. Not in a straight line, but staggered slightly, each choosing a path close enough to benefit from earlier compression, far enough to avoid concentrating too much weight. Each crossing took time. The thaw widened with every passage. What had been a narrow band of softened ground now spread outward in irregular shapes, responding to pressure patterns rather than surface appearance. Water no longer stayed confined to impressions. It seeped laterally, finding low points, forming shallow channels that connected footprints together. The tundra was being asked to change faster than it preferred. A calf crossed last. It was smaller, lighter, but less experienced. Its steps were quicker, less patient. When its hoof sank suddenly, it froze, startled by the sensation rather than endangered by it. The adult nearest it shifted position immediately, stepping closer without touching, altering the pressure field just enough to firm the ground beneath the calf's weight. The calf steadied and continued. Once all had crossed, the herd reformed slowly on firmer ground. No one moved off immediately. Breathing slowed, heads lifted. The muskoxens stood with the thaw behind them, altered and quiet. The crossing remained visible. Water-filled depressions reflected the grey sky. Mud clung to hair and hooves. The path would not disappear overnight. Even when temperatures dropped again, the impressions would freeze into place, locking the memory of passage into the surface. The ground had taken too long. Not dangerously long. Not catastrophically. But long enough to matter. The herd began to move again, angling toward higher ground where drainage was better, where thaw would arrive later and leave sooner. Their pace was unchanged, but their route had shifted. Behind them, the tundra continued its slow adjustment, water redistributing, soil settling by fractions, ice beneath responding in its own delayed rhythm. The muskoxen did not look back. They carried the change forward in mud-darkened hair and heavier steps, moving on with the understanding that crossings like this would become more common and that the land would not always answer weight with the speed it once had. The thaw had not stopped them, but it had already begun to shape how and how often they could move. The herd did not move far after the crossing. They angled upslope only slightly, enough to gain marginally firmer ground, then slowed again. The effort of the thaw lingered in their bodies, not as exhaustion, but as awareness. Muscles had worked longer than usual to maintain balance. Joints had held strain unevenly. The delay beneath each step had required constant adjustment. The land ahead looked similar to what they had crossed. That was the problem. From a distance, the tundra gave no clear warning. Snow still lay in thin, broken sheets. Vegetation remained pressed low, its colour unchanged. But the response underfoot had shifted, and the Muskoxen knew it now. They moved more cautiously. Spacing increased. Where they might once have walked closer together for warmth or cohesion, they now allowed more distance between bodies. This reduced cumulative pressure on any single patch of ground. It also slowed the herd without any individual choosing to slow. The delay travelled through them. The lead muskox tested the ground repeatedly, stopping more often than before. Each pause was brief, but together they lengthened progress. When it stepped, it waited for the surface to answer, waiting for the subtle sag, the rise of water, the faint sound of ice shifting below. Sometimes the ground answered quickly, sometimes it did not. When it did not, the muskox remained still, holding weight mid-transfer until resistance stabilized. This posture was demanding. It required constant muscular engagement, especially through the shoulders and hips. The others mirrored the behavior without instruction. Behind them, the earlier crossing remained visible even at a distance. The thawed path had widened slightly as water continued to redistribute, connecting depressions into a shallow, irregular band. The ground was still changing after the herd had left it. Time lagged behind action. A light wind moved across the tundra, bringing cooler air from higher ground. It brushed the long hair along their sides, drying mud slowly, unevenly. Where hair dried, it stiffened. Where it remained wet, it clung, adding drag with each step. The herd paused again, this time not because of immediate softness, but because of uncertainty. Ahead lay another low area where meltwater had collected. It was not as wide as the first thaw, but it was darker, smoother, less textured. The lead muskox approached and stopped. It lowered its head, not to graze, but to assess scent and sound. The smell of wet soil was stronger here, mixed with the faint metallic note of exposed mineral. The ground was thinly frozen beneath the surface, enough to look solid, not enough to trust. The muskox waited. Seconds passed. Nothing changed. The ground did not firm further. It did not drain. It remained in suspension, neither one state nor the other. The herd waited with it. This waiting carried cost. Body heat dissipated more quickly when standing still on wet ground. Calves shifted weight restlessly. Adults adjusted stance to reduce strain. Eventually, the lead muskox stepped forward. The ground sagged immediately, more than before. Water surfaced faster, pooling around the hoof. The muskox did not withdraw. It held position, muscles tight, letting the ground complete its movement. The delay was longer this time. The ground took too long again, but it did respond, slowly stabilizing, not collapsing fully. The muskox transferred weight and moved on, clearing space for the others. This second crossing was shorter, but harder. The ground had already been primed by thaw. It remembered pressure more readily now. Each hoofprint deepened more quickly than the last. The herd spread further, crossing on slightly different lines, trying not to widen a single weak point too much. The calf hesitated again. This time, the adult nearest did not move closer immediately. It waited a heartbeat longer, allowing the calf to test, withdraw, test again. Learning here could not be rushed. The calf crossed successfully, but slower. Once across, the herd regrouped on higher ground again. Breathing was heavier now, not laboured, but deeper. Heads lifted, bodies angled slightly into the wind to reduce heat loss from damp hair. They had crossed twice. Both times the land had answered, but late. That lateness was now part of the terrain. The Muskoxans stood quietly, adjusting to the knowledge that future crossings would not behave the way memory suggested. The tundra was no longer synchronized with their movement. It responded on its own schedule. The Thaw had not trapped them, it had not stopped them, but it had introduced delay into every decision, turning time itself into weight that had to be carried with each step forward. And as the herd moved on once more, choosing higher, drier ground even at the cost of longer routes, the tundra behind them continued its slow work, settling, spreading, holding shape far longer than the animals that had pressed it into motion could afford to wait. The tundra did not harden again. It also did not collapse. It remained in between, soft enough to respond, firm enough to carry weight, slow enough to demand patience from everything that moved across it. This middle state stretched outward, expanding with the day as temperatures hovered just above freezing. The herd adjusted without discussion. Their pace slowed further, not because of immediate danger, but because speed no longer matched the land's ability to respond. Movement that once flowed now arrived in segments. Step, wait, settle, step again. The Muskoxans spaced themselves even more. Where closeness had once conserved heat and cohesion, it now compounded pressure. Each animal needed its own patch of ground to test, its own margin to absorb delay. The herd lengthened into a loose line, connected by sight rather than proximity. Mud continued to dry unevenly along their legs. Where it hardened, it pulled at hair, adding drag. Where it remained wet, it cooled the skin beneath, drawing heat away slowly. The Muskoxan compensated instinctively, angling their bodies into the wind, lifting hooves higher to avoid brushing against saturated ground. The lead Muskox paused again. This pause lasted longer than the others. Ahead, the land rose slightly, no more than a meter over several dozen meters, but the change mattered. Higher ground drained faster, ice beneath was thicker. The response time of the surface would improve there. The Muskox waited, then turned its body subtly toward that rise. The others followed without question. This detour lengthened the route, but it reduced uncertainty. The herd chose predictability over efficiency. In a landscape where the ground answered slowly, that choice mattered more than distance. Behind them, the earlier thaw zones continued to change. Water seeped outward from their impressions, not draining away, but redistributing. Thin films froze briefly when clouds passed, then softened again as light returned. The surface never returned to neutral. The ground held memory. The herd did not test it again. As they moved upslope, footing improved gradually. The delay beneath each step shortened. Water surfaced less readily. Resistance returned more quickly. Not fully, but enough. Breathing eased. Pauses shortened. The herd's rhythm stabilized into something closer to what it had been before the thaw. Calves moved more confidently now, their steps lighter, less tentative. Adults still tested the surface, but their posture relaxed slightly, muscles no longer holding tension between every movement. They stopped once more near a patch of exposed vegetation where wind had scoured snow thin. The Muskoxan fed briefly. Grazing here was slower, heads lifting often, but the act itself was grounding. Eating did not compress the land the way walking did. It allowed time without pressure. The thaw remained visible behind them, dark, reflective, uneven. Ahead, the tundra looked unchanged. That was misleading, but acceptable for now. The herd did not rush to leave the thaw behind completely. They remained aware of it, carrying its lesson forward, that the land's response time had shifted and that movement would need to adapt accordingly. The tundra had not become hostile, it had become slower, and as the Muskoxan resumed their steady advance across higher ground, they did so with a revised rhythm, one that accounted not just for distance and weather, but for the quiet lag between wait and response that now shaped every step. The ground would continue to thaw. It would continue to take its time. And the herd, shaped by patience as much as strength, moved on, no longer expecting the land to answer quickly, but willing to wait when it did not.